First order of business. If things get out of hand, everybody should turn theirs off, right?
Push some buttons.
So apparently this doesn't amplify us, it's just for the TV audience, right? Sandy says it sounds good.
Work fine.
So there's 12 of us here tonight, and we believe that 13 is a quorum. So we don't have a quorum, but we can do our introductory stuff. We don't have to vote on anything tonight anyhow. A lot of this is educational, which is hopefully going to get us through other meetings more smoothly. And so I think the first order of business is kind of to do a round of introductions. I know we have our cards up, but I'm Ed Collins. I'm a lawyer in Rockland. I'll turn it over to Drew.
Hi, I'm Drew Lyman. I run Lyman Morse and live right down, obviously.
I'm Kip Wright. I own Abigail's Inn. I also run Mano Kent, which is Booth Bay Register, Wiscasset, and the Pin Bay Pilot.
So you don't have to speak into these because they're not amplifying. Just talk to us.
Okay, I'm Joe Marina Doran. I live here in Camden, and I work over at Camden National Bank.
Dick Householder, I'm retired. I was on the planning board 14 years.
Mark Haskell, I'm a retired photographer, been here since '79.
Robin McIntosh, I'm on CDAC, the Camden Economic Community Development Advisory Committee. Come up with that.
I'm Lehman Scott. I'm retired. I've been here about 3.5 years, also on CDAC.
Mark Corsi, I'm a lawyer here in Camden.
Lisa Dresser, I'm a real estate broker with an office in Rockland.
I'm Sandy Cox. I'm also a real estate broker in Rockland.
Tia Anderson, I'm Director of Midcoast Habitat for Humanity.
And I'm Audra Kaler-Bell, I'm the town manager.
Okay.
Oh, and our finance manager apologizes for not being here. She came down with the flu unexpectedly this morning.
Unexpectedly, yeah.
That's Jody Hanson, and some of us met with her when we did the tour of the town office. And so everybody should have their book at this point. And I guess the first order of business, we should all turn our phones off, or at least silence them. And we're going to do a slideshow, I think, with going through some of the different components about the budget. We did this last year as an introduction, and I think it was pretty helpful to answer a lot of questions that come up. A lot of things that we talk about apply town-wide to each department, so if we can cover them at a meeting like this, then later on we don't have to spend time in each individual department. One of the things we need to make sure we remember to address is the Freedom of Information Act qualification, and I suppose we should send around that little certification letter, and I will try to get that done here in the next couple days. There's a test you have to take. I think it's open book, and but it's the basic deal is we are in a public forum. The public has full right to access all of our activities, attend our meetings, and so part of this, when we're on emails as a group, we should not be conducting any actual business or voting or advocacy. It's all about scheduling and things like that. I don't think it's a problem to send somebody an article and say, hey, look at this, but we shouldn't be debating in our sort of our closed email loop. That's all to be done here at the public session. So that's sort of the crux of the Freedom of Information Act stuff. A couple of preliminary notes that I want to cover that comes up as we go around and consider things we vote. So the question is, does the chair vote or not vote? Last year, I think the group said they were fine with the chair voting. Typically, the chair always votes in the event of a tie, one way or the other, but otherwise it's probably not too relevant. But if anybody has any comments on that? Anybody care? No? So I'll probably vote. The other thing we did this year was we did department meetings where we went around to Public Works, the library, places like that. We did that 2 years ago, and we got pretty good turnout, and it was, for a lot of us, the first time we'd been to a lot of these locations, and I thought it was a pretty helpful experience. This year we did it. We actually got pretty low turnout. I think the sessions were still really good. You get to really talk to the department heads one-on-one and learn what their issues are without the formality of the meeting. Probably my recommendation now is that we not do it next year for sure, but might even skip another year and then consider it every 3 years, something like that, where you really have a fresh group rather than a group where half of them or more have already been to all these places. Yes, Robin?
I think last time we did it, it was in the fall. This time was mostly in January, in December, because I know I was gone for the whole month of December, so I couldn't attend them, but the timing might be part of that too, just a thought.
Yeah, so we can consider that. I mean, I think it'll be, for next year's group to consider at the end of their meetings what they want to do, but that's certainly something to keep in mind. I remember that both times I've been to Public Works, it was really cold, so it was. I was there, yeah. Yeah, it was 19 degrees and really windy, and I wasn't ready for it yet. It was like, another topic that is nice to cover now is, and we'll get to this in maybe Audra will touch on it too, but we've had these provider agencies, the local service clubs who come to the town and ask for funds. And so we've, in the past, had debates about do we give it to particular groups or not. And what was helpful last year was we, as a group, decided to honor those requests rather than debate whether to do it or not at that time. And then that kind of shortened a lot of our discussion when we got down to the actual hearing to decide whether to do it or not. So this year, I think a lot of these provider agencies have actually shifted their funding over to some of the trust funds that the town has been the beneficiary of. And so we don't really have that many, but we can, I think, are you going to touch on that a little later tonight, or should we just?
I mean, we can talk about it now.
Okay. So I guess as a group, the question is, do you want to give money out of the town tax revenues to these nonprofits who do activities in the town of Camden, or not do that? Anybody have any comments? Thoughts on that? Yep.
Considering that the amount that we've given is not even close to a percentage of the total budget, I've never had an issue with it. So I always have said, let's do it.
Yep. And that's true. It doesn't total more than $20,000 or something. Yeah, maybe, and it's going to be less this year, so. Everybody, yes, Mark?
20-some-odd years ago, when I was on this committee, we spent hours and hours and hours going over that, so I think that is an absolute blessing. Thank you guys for doing that.
All right. So I think the sense of our group is then, yes, we will consider positively making grants, and I think they're actually all in your notebook in tab 6, so take a look at them. If anybody has any big problems with them, let us know, but when we get to that particular section of our budget review, then we'll probably move through that quite quickly. And I don't know if we'll let last year they all showed up, and I think they were very disappointed they didn't get to make their pitch, so we might try to address that with them. So I think my final, well, I guess I got two more sections here. One is, everything's laid out. We got a really nice notebook here. The meeting schedule's all laid out, so take a look at stuff ahead of time. It'll help everything go more smoothly. Try to be prepared. Anybody remember Dave Nichols? He was a lawyer here in town for decades and decades, and when he swore me into the bar, he said, "Just be prepared when you show up in court." So. The other thing that's in our materials that will pop up here is just how we actually run the meetings. And so, in general, we'll have the town manager do an introduction of a department head. The department head will then speak. We can sort of have a question and answer period. And then somebody in our committee will make a motion to do something, accept the budget as proposed, some alternate amount. There'll be a second of the motion, and then we have debate. The debate starts with the person who made the motion. Once everybody gets a chance to speak, then we will vote on the motion. And we're following sort of a condense Robert's rules. If we have to get into more layers, we can certainly do that with motions to amend or motions to reconsider and that type of thing. But for the most part, seemed like we worked through this with some formality, but we don't get overly wound up about it for the most part. I think that's all I've got to say. How much? Well, I've taken more than 10 minutes, so I think I overran my allocation. And so now I guess I just turn it over to Audra to kind of go through the budget process.
All right, so I apologize to anyone who heard this presentation last year, but for people who are new, I thought, sort of going over it again would be useful. So I guess when it comes to a town preparing a budget, especially when you have a town meeting form of government where the citizens are the ones who are the legislative body and make all the decisions, really the budget is the foundational policy that we use to set the agenda for the coming year. It really begins and ends with the budget. So I think it's a really important job what you're doing. It kind of sets us up for what we can do for the year ahead, and it affects everybody. So, not only is it something that we use to kind of control how we spend money, but it also helps us manage our organization. It gives us authority to spend money and certain people authority to purchase certain things. And it's also what we use for decision-making purposes. So the select board behind us here, they're really bound by the decisions that are made through the budget that constrains how they are able to spend money. Same thing with the departments. And it also allows us to communicate what we're doing to the public. So it has a lot of different purposes within the organization. So Camden uses a line item budget, which is very common. Most municipalities do the same thing. So that's just a different way of grouping information together. We're allowed, it gives us a really great ability to control how we spend money because everything is so specifically laid out in each line item. But we don't have a great deal of flexibility because it is so specifically spelled out as to what we're spending money on and how much. And you've probably all flipped through the budget, so this looks very familiar. This is, just an example of what you'll see for each department. So the whole document itself, we have the budget message, which is sort of the high level, the letter that I write explaining, what it is we're trying to achieve. Then you have your net commitment, which is expenditures, revenues, you add in what the school assessment is going to be, and then the county assessment, and that gives you sort of the overall picture of what the budget's going to be for the upcoming year. And then summaries of expenditures, so it doesn't go into real detail, it just gives you sort of the broad categories and what the expenditure is. Revenues lays out all the non-tax-based money that comes into the municipality. And we have some different parts of the budget. So the general fund is the different departments and all of the spending that has to do with day-to-day operations within the departments. And then you get down to areas like debt service, capital improvements and reserves. And that's the bigger projects that we're looking at. So debt service, that's the money that, we're spending each year on the interest and principal payments for bonds that we've taken out in the past or loans that we've taken out to do projects or buy equipment. And then we have a bunch of capital improvement projects and reserves. And really that's what I would really recommend you focus on that a lot, because that's where, as a budget committee, you have a real ability to add a lot of input by looking at what we're proposing to spend money on in terms of capital projects and, just giving input into what you think about those priorities. And, that's one of the things that we spend the most time on as a municipality, because I'm telling you, it's an endless list of capital improvements and juggling, a road improvement versus some sort of sewer system upgrade or the dams. There's just so much infrastructure that we need to attend to each year. So juggling those and figuring out what can we do this year, what's urgent, what is going to keep it at a reasonable level for taxpayers. That's, I think, the most important thing that we do on a year-to-year basis. And then we have some special revenue funds, which we'll bring before the budget committee for advisory purposes, the snowball being one and then the wastewater department being the other. So we've talked about the budget message and net commitment. The summary, this is what you'll see in that. It also includes the assessment from Midcoast Solid Waste, so that's kind of tacked on at the end. Like I said before, revenues are all non-property tax-based sources of revenue, and a good example of that would be vehicle excise tax, any fees that we collect for services that are provided, animal control, any town clerk fees. Harbor revenue is included in the revenues line. That's one of the larger single department revenues. Also, our tax increment financing districts, if we use any of that revenue to offset any projects, that'll come in the revenue line, as well as if we're bonding any money, that will show up in revenue, or if we're proposing to bond money, that'll show up in revenue as well. So the general fund, like we talked about, day-to-day expenses for departments, this is where you'll see payroll, benefits, and then the more sort of mundane things that we do, like buy office supplies and fuel and equipment, small equipment. So capital improvements, these are the major purchases and projects. So I'd say a general rule of thumb is anything over $10,000, but that's not always hard or fast. Sometimes there are things right on the line. It could go into capital improvements, but maybe it goes into the department budget. Either way, we'll point it out. So, examples could be, we're buying a big piece of equipment like a new plow truck or fire truck, or it could be a capital project like building a new park or putting in a sewer line. So capital reserves, these are a number of funds that we set aside for different purposes. So some of them are savings for projects that we want to plan in the future. We have a reserve for the Washington Street sidewalk project, so money that we're putting away is matched to a grant for a project that we're going to do with MDOT. We also have, some accounts that are more set aside for incremental improvements. So things like storm drains that we try to chip away at each year and fix a little bit every year. And then we have other funds that we set aside for emergency purposes. And that's a good example of that is our winter maintenance reserve. So if we have a really bad winter and we think we're going to overspend on our operating budget, we have this reserve so it doesn't, we're prepared and we don't have to look for other sources of funding for something like that. So debt service, like we talked about before, this is the principal and interest payments on any leases for capital equipment, any loans that we've taken out or bonds. So a good example, the tannery demolition that was done a number of years ago, that still shows up as a bond payment. The public safety building, when we built that, you'll see that payment in there as well. And a lot of bigger capital equipment purchases like fire trucks or new dump trucks from Public Works is purchased. And this is all really important in keeping an eye on the debt because we want to keep that sort of level on a year-to-year basis. And I try to be as conscious as possible about not, waiting, like for an example, Public Works needs a new plow truck, and we talked about purchasing one this year, but we know that the debt service for the most recent dump truck that they purchased isn't coming off until next year. So we're not proposing to buy it this year. We're going to wait until next year. So I think that's, really important when you're looking at debt is how are we planning on a year-to-year basis, or how are we planning in the future so that when we bring you a budget on a year-to-year basis, it's taking into account what picture looks like over the next few years. And in your books, we've done a bit of an analysis of what our total position is in terms of debt, when debt falls off, what it's for. So special revenue funds, as I said before, we've got two, the wastewater department and the snow bowl. And the budget committee will review these, but at the end of the day, the wastewater commissioners, who are the select board, as well as the select board, they make the final, they make the decision on these. So it's more of an advisory role that the budget committee serves in the instances of these. So here's a timeline for the meetings, but you already have that, so we don't really need to go over that too much, do we?
Yeah, you mean this page here?
Yep.
Yep, right. Yeah, all our meeting dates and everything is all in the book, and it's been emailed to everybody, so.
think last year we might have finished a little bit early, so that could happen again this year, you never know.
Right.
Right.
Right. The goal is to get to Thursday, March 28th, and not have too much left to discuss, and that's when we finally pull it all together and say we are voting to accept whatever budget we have adopted in pieces over the meetings.
All right, so one thing that I didn't do last year that I thought I would do this year is just a little bit of analysis between the differences from last year to this year and where we're kind of looking like we're going right now. So for FY20, there's always a few challenges to every single year. So we're in the middle of negotiating a collective bargaining agreement with the police union. Also, there are payroll increases that we're looking at. So we're looking at a 3% COLA for a cost of living adjustment for all staff. There was a long list of, like we talked about before, a long list of deferred maintenance and capital projects that need to be addressed. And there are some things that, everybody was hoping we'd have a little bit more time to plan for and not have to do right away. A good example is the West Dam. We've got a gate that's failing on that. We were hoping that we would have 5 more years before we needed to touch that, given the fact that we needed to invest a lot of money in Seabright Dam last year. But unfortunately, it's at a place where we're afraid that if we wait any longer, the gate could fail and we would be making emergency repairs anyway. So, it's a kind of example of a project that, we might not have wanted to do now, but we don't really have a lot of choice. So also there's a need to invest in some infrastructure projects where we're focusing more on sustainability and adaptation to severe weather events. A good example being we have the seawall in Harbor Park that is continually getting eroded. The blocks that make up the wall are being pushed out. So we could do a status quo repair, and I could come back to you 3 to 5 years later and say, hey, guess what? That seawall that we put $75,000 to $100,000 in is eroded again, and the blocks are pushing out. So we have to go back and make a repair again. Or we can look at doing something that looks a little bit more long-term at the reality of what's going to happen, which is continuous severe weather and, sea level rising, and how we address that so that we're not making a temporary repair that just needs to be fixed again. And also there's some energy efficiency projects that it's going to be a bit of an upfront cost in terms of, debt that we're paying, but in the end, the payback period on them is going to be relatively short for what we're going to end up with. And the replacement of all the street lights across town with LEDs and transitioning from CMP owned to municipal ownership is a good example of one of those projects, but there are a few other things we can do that I think will have a long-term savings to the community. And also, we need to be prepared for what we know is coming within the next 3 to 4 years, which are large debt service payments for the upgrades to the wastewater treatment plant. So that's a almost $14 million project. And I think there's a way that we can prepare for those payments so that it doesn't hit us all at once and we are kind of, gradually staging into it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later and how I think we can do that. And also, we have some succession planning that we need to consider with, staff who are retiring or planning to retire. And we have a very tight labor market that we're also contending with in the face of having to recruit and retain people. So some of the solutions, so we're fortunate that town has a very healthy surplus right now. And while I don't want to go and, raid that surplus, there are certainly things that we can fund out of that, which would keep it from hitting, the tax base this year. And also, I think that we can use that money as well to self-finance some projects so that we're, not taking on additional debt. So what we would be doing is we would be spending out of the surplus and then paying ourselves back over a course of years. So we're not, depleting that surplus. We have, our downtown TIF picked up a lot of value as a result of the revow, and that money can be used towards projects that qualify in the downtown TIF district, and we do have a few of those. And that's a big help in offsetting the expense of those projects so they aren't hitting the tax base in this budget. And we do have a number of reserve funds that they've been built up to a healthy level, and we can use those to offset the cost of some of our capital projects. And as I talked about before, investing in some of the projects with long-term savings. So a good example of this, when we convert those street lights, it'll take us about 4.5 years to pay that back at the same level we're spending on now. But after that, we'll be saving about $36,000 a year in money that we aren't paying to CMP for lease fees and the reduction in electricity cost as a result of converting over to LEDs. And there's a number of different projects we can do in terms of weatherization and some energy efficiency upgrades. Also, in terms of preparing for the debt service for the wastewater treatment plant, I think it would be wise to start a reserve fund and start putting some significant money away in that. So one, we're gradually preparing ourselves for the debt service that we're going to be paying every year, which will be close to $600,000, as well as kind of buffering ourselves against the impacts so that, when it comes on board, we have some of that money in the reserve fund to gradually offset the cost of that or the impact of that, so that instead of getting that hit all in 1 year, it's felt more over time. So when you look at the proportion of expenses, if you're just looking at sort of the major categories of the budget, this is sort of the breakdown. So about a quarter of the budget is debt, general government, which is, all the operations in the town office, like planning and development and finance department. Included in that, I think, is all of the, the Opera House related expenses, all of our insurance, all of our IT, all that kind of stuff. It's a little bit less than a quarter. Public safety, that's police, fire, EMS, what we pay to Knox County for dispatch services. That's a quarter of our budget. And then the Public Works Department and all the money that we spend on a year-to-year basis in maintaining roads and other infrastructure such as that. That's about 17% of our budget. As we were talking about before, health and welfare, so the money that we give to external organizations who provide a service to the community, it's less than 1% of our entire overall budget. The reason is that we have a lot of trust funds that were left to the town, and by the stipulations of the trust funds, a lot of the different service providers, they qualify under those trust funds, so we're able to use that money to give it to those agencies. There are some who come to us who are asking for contributions from the town, and they don't qualify for trust funds, but they provide a valuable service, and we've all talked about that before, so that's why they're included. Leisure services, that's parks, recreation, harbor, library, all those sorts of departments, and then cemeteries are kind of on their own with that small little 1%. So our revenues, a lot of it comes in through licenses, permits, fees at 34%. State revenue, it's at 8%. They've been talking about increasing revenue sharing, but I'll believe it when I see it, so I kind of held it at what it was last year. I was a little generous. I thought maybe they can do 4,000 more than they did last year, so I rounded it off at an even 200,000. Other departmental income, it's about 16%, and we just have other smaller pieces. So the other financing sources, that's when we use things like the TIF to offset other expenses that we have. If we're going to use money out of surplus, if we're going to bond anything, that's where that comes in. So impacts on expenditures. So with the 3% COLA, there's a few new positions which we'll talk about adding in the Public Works Department, as well as a deputy clerk, switching a deputy clerk from part-time to 30 hours, as well as some stipends And then another contributing factor is there were some new hires in this financial year that have increased this wages amount to about $197,000 over last year. So our health insurance actually decreased this year. A lot of that came down to just people choosing not to take the town's health insurance because, for whatever reason. So we had a little bit of an increase in retirement that the town contributes. So capital reserves, a lot of this increase is a result of my proposal to put aside $100,000 for the wastewater reserve to prepare for the debt service that we're going to be paying in the future. And there's a $187,000 increase in capital improvement projects. And we'll talk about these in great detail, so I won't go into any of that now. And then emergency services, there's some, increase that we're paying to the Regional Communication Center. And since we haven't negotiated EMS yet, I thought it was better to err on the side of caution and increase that a little bit as well. So our revenues, we're looking at an increase in tax lien interest just based on historical data. State revenues, a little bit in, revenue sharing and local road assistance, I think is going to decrease. So we didn't think that was going to be significant. A little bit in licenses, permits, and fees. A lot of that is auto excise has been really strong, and there's no reason to believe it won't be strong again this year. But I wanted to be prepared for, there's some talk on a federal level that the town might not receive the same amount in cable TV franchise fees that we receive. We get about $70,000 a year now, but there's talk that the cable companies might be able to count things that they do, like, let us broadcast our meetings over, a cable station as part, that's an in-kind contribution that they're saying might be counted towards our franchise fees, so that could reduce the amount of cash revenue that we get from them. So I don't know where that's going on a federal level, but I just wanted to be prepared in case there was some sort of decrease in that.
So write your Congress people.
Yeah. Or write the FCC. Miscellaneous revenue, so we've been earning quite a bit more interest on our cash accounts with Camden National Bank, and we hadn't really adjusted that given the increase that we've been experiencing. So we did a little bit of a readjustment in that this year, as well as just other miscellaneous revenue that we get through. And we're looking at, like we said, the income from trust funds to offset some of the social service expenses. And the other financing sources is what we talked about before. So using the unassigned fund balance to self-finance some projects. That accounts for most of that, as well as the TIF revenue. All right, so I know I've talked a lot about debt, but it's really important just to keep this in mind whenever we're preparing the budget. So our total outstanding long-term debt for, our major capital projects is about $4.3 million, and our average interest rate, we're looking at 2.58%. And so capital leases, that's about $300,000, and they have a higher interest rate. All right, so, when we're doing the budget, everybody likes to have a good idea of what is this going to do to taxes, what's the impact going to be. So our current mill rate is $14.88 per $1,000 of value, and that's arrived at by taking our total valuation as a town and, I'll go the other way, taking the total that we spend on a town for schools, county, and then town expenses, and dividing that by our total valuation as a town, and that's how we arrive at our mill rate. And just to give you an idea of where we are, so I did have to take out some communities in Knox County because it got way too confusing, so I took out a lot of the islands because this was pretty skewed. But if you look at, I wish I had a laser pointer, so.
Oh, I think we do have one.
Oh, okay. So 2017, so the far left kind of shows where Camden is in comparison to all the other Knox County communities, and we're sort of like the medium color red.
Good pointer.
For all those who are colorblind.
I think you got it, Bob. It's perfect.
The shadow.
Yeah,
Colorblind, I can't tell.
yeah.
So does that show that back in 16, our mill rate was above 15?
That's right.
That's correct.
Yeah, the reval changed that. So, yeah, I mean,
Revaluation increased $275 million.
so, in comparison to all the other Knox County communities, we're sort of in the middle. We're less than all the other service centers, but higher than, the peninsula communities with lots of coastal land and lots of value. So if you look at some of kind of comparative service centers that are in the area, so I included, Bar Harbor's not a great comparison, but I just thought for fun we'd put them in there. If you look at, Belfast, Damariscotta, Rockland, Rockport, Thomaston, we're the, sort of the blue.
This is Camden.
Yep, we're right there. So that's kind of how we stack up against other service centers.
When did I find one?
We have lasers.
That in his pocket.
Anyway, just to give you a bit of context of where we kind of stand. And this is our history since 2009. So on average, our mill rate increases about 19 cents per year.
What year did the reval take place?
That was, so you see the 216 to 217, it was in 2017 that,
Okay.
yeah. So another thing to take into consideration when we're talking about impact on taxes and, the breakdown of how, the mill rate works. Our total mill rate is $14.88. And so out of that, 61% is the schools, 7% is the county, and 32% is the town in this budget that we're talking about. So, if you're looking at a home with a value of $300,000 in Camden, of that total tax bill for that home, about $1,400 of it is for specifically town services, as opposed to what you pay for the school or the county. So where I'm getting with this is that, in terms of an impact on taxes, we're looking at, if you want to reduce the tax rate by a cent, that would be cutting spending by about $12,800, or on the opposite side, increasing revenue by the same amount. And then you can, same, like assessed value also factors into this as well. So it's not just what we're spending, but it's also how much are we growing in value. And we do have point in time snapshots of this. We are going to pick up some additional value this year. So it's really hard to say at any point in time, what is the mill rate going to look like? Because it's not just what we're doing here in this room, it's also everything that's happening outside. And, how much value are we picking up as a town? That factors into it as well. But it takes a lot of value, as you can see, for that to, really significantly impact the mill rate. All right, so does anybody have any questions about any of that? No? Okay. All right, so one of the biggest, things that I think, instead of talking about it for each individual department budget, Ed and I thought it was better to talk about wages and benefits up front and kind of explain how that works, and, give everybody the chance to talk about that or ask questions. So when it comes to employee benefits and how decisions are made around that, so in the personnel policy, insurance and retirement benefits are offered to employees. And that, the authority through that comes in the personnel policy. So for police officers, it's part of their collective bargaining agreement with the town. And the select board has the authority to review the level of employee contributions to health insurance and also choose the town's health insurance carrier. And we have Maine Municipal Employee Health Trust, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too. So if you look at, for this year, the impact on the budget, so we're looking at, $970,000 for health insurance, and that's about 10% of the overall budget. Retirement's about 2.8%. FICA, Medicare, around the same. Wages, that's 2.8 million, so that's about 30.24% of the budget. So if you add, wages and benefits all together, it's 45.5% of our overall budget. So we offer 3 health insurance plans. So, there's different sort of levels of coverage and, different premiums versus deductibles that you pay for each. And the majority, and they're all offered to full-time employees. And the majority of employees choose the most comprehensive plan that provides the highest level of coverage. It's the highest cost plan because of the coverage that's provided. One of the things about this is, of the different plans that are offered, the higher cost plans tend to have less fluctuation year to year than the lower cost plans. So the way that it works with the health insurance that's offered is that any employees who were hired with the town of Camden before January 1st, 2007, they receive 100% employer contribution towards their coverage as well as that of their dependents. So anyone who was hired after that date, 100% of their, premium is covered, and only 80% of their dependents are covered. 80% of their dependents covered by the town. So part-time employees, they can receive coverage, but they have to pay 100% of that cost. And the only exception to this is the lowest cost plan, and any employee who chooses to take that, it covers 100% of, them and their dependents. So we also offer group life insurance, so that comes as part of the health insurance. There's a choice of retirement plans, so there's the main PERS plan, so the employee pays 8%, the employer pays 9.6%, but this can change annually, and then also ICMA, which is a deferred compensation plan, so that's 5% payroll deduction and matched by the town. We also offer vision insurance, dental insurance, income protection, AFLAC, but that's all paid by the employee. So these are just, payroll deductions towards these different plans. So our health insurance provider is Maine Municipal Employee Health Trust. So it's a not-for-profit group self-funded trust. It's regulated by the Maine Bureau of Insurance. So, it's self-funding for all medical, dental. It's a third-party administrator to the claims, so everybody can call up if they have an issue. They can call the health trust, and they help them with processing claims. It has all financial responsibility to ensure that the claims are paid, and everybody is, all municipalities who participate in the state of Maine get pooled so that, the liability is shared amongst that entire pool. And they reinsure themselves as well. So in the insurance for vision life, that's fully insured as well. So they set rates by working with an actuarial firm, and I review, 24 months worth of claims to set their rates and project future cost. That's kind of, since we're a part of a pooled group, because we cover fewer than 50 employees, we've got pretty stable costs from year to year. We don't, with some of the other rated groups, when they have a larger group of employees, certain claims that they can have by individual employees affect them more than with the town of Camden.
How many employees
do we cover? Oh, I looked at this before. It's like 40, we're right on the line of.
I thought it was pushing.
Yeah, it's very, very close. And they're pretty fiscally conservative in how they set their rates, so there isn't, any chance of a shortfall or big fluctuations from year to year. So this is an example of their rate adjustment history, and the POSC program, as I was talking about, it's, over the years it's had kind of the lowest increase from year to year. So it is the highest cost plan, but it tends to be more stable in its costs from year to year. And a lot of that has to do with, some of the bigger fluctuations in healthcare costs have to do with prescription drugs. And so the lower cost plans are having to adjust for that. So just to give you an idea, we did, when I first got here, we did do a little bit of shopping around to look and see, would we be better off outside of Maine Municipal Employee Health Trust? And, we did find alternatives that were cheaper, but it did put us in a really risky position because instead of being pooled with 450 different municipalities and all that risk being distributed amongst all of those different communities, we would be our own little group. So one person getting really sick could spike our premiums to a really high level from year to year. And I asked Maine Municipal Employee Health Trust to give me an example of other municipalities that made the switch and came back, or counties that made the switch and came back, and why they did that. So this is kind of an example of different groups that came back to the health trust because of sort of going out with a different provider and having that experience. So this is sort of what you'd be looking at if you weren't part of a pooled group and you had, a certain year where somebody got hurt or sick or whatever the case may be. So, the benefit is that, our risk is pooled, so if something happens to somebody, it isn't going to impact our premiums to the extent that if we were a smaller group. And also, over the years, the Health Trust has really done an excellent job of keeping the rate increases at a minimum. So the health insurance market's really volatile, but it's very rare that their rate increases will exceed 10%. So I know that, everybody's talked about health insurance a lot in the past, but this is, I think, the benefit that's most valued by far for all of our employees. We've had people who have been here for decades, and health insurance and good benefits have been a huge part of retaining those people. Over the past year for recruiting new staff, there's been a number of staff who I haven't been able to compete with other communities that they've come from on wages. But when it comes to health insurance, that's been the thing that's made us competitive with other places. So it's really been my single greatest recruiting tool over the past year that I've been here. And, given that Maine's experiencing a labor shortage, everybody's competing for people, it's really hard to get good employees, and, having good benefits is the thing that's really made it better, better for us and competitive in a really competitive labor market. And also, this has given the town a reputation as a great employer. We have very few union shops in the town of Camden, and I think a lot of that has to do with employees really feel valued here. They really feel like they're treated well by the town, and I think that's really something Camden should be proud of.
Do you compare that to other towns?
What's that?
Who has a lot of unions in other towns?
Yeah, I don't think
Specifically point out.
No?
Well, okay, I came from the city of Rockland, and there was a clerical union for everybody who did clerical type work. There was a union for the wastewater department. There was a union for the public works department. There was a union for people who worked at the transfer station. There was a police union. There was a firefighters union. In the town of Camden, we have the police union, and that's it. So I have one collective bargaining agreement I have to do every year as opposed to 4, 5, 6. And, sorry, I thought you were asking.
That's exactly what I wanted to hear.
And I guess a good example, so the town of Thomaston, they did away with offering benefits for dependents. And now their police department is gone. They're going to have to get the county to cover them. And it's the same thing, their ambulance department is almost gone as well. So, this is the benefit I see in making sure that we take care of our employees.
What's next? Are you
That's
gonna
it.
do more? So one comment I have on just staffing is that when we look at the budget and you think about how do we decrease the budget, unfortunately, you're really facing cutting personnel, and cutting personnel means cutting services, and so a lot of what we're doing in the budget is trying to evaluate what kind of service do we want in town, what are we willing to pay for services, and it costs a lot to have an employee, you know, with wage, salary, retirement, all the things that have just been laid out. So if you're thinking about how do you approach a particular department or something in the budget that you think looks a little high or you'd like to adjust, that employee staff level is really the place that real adjustments can occur, but it also has an impact on services. So, you know, I think when we get down to it, that's a lot of what we end up trying to consider is how many people do you want working at your town and what are they doing, and you know, what are we looking for services? Do we need more? Do we need less? And but that's where the dollars are, I think, and what was 45% of our budget. So
I have a question. In an employee, you got a salary. Is there a percentage you could tell us that you tack on to that to cover health insurance and all the other costs of having an employee? Is there a percentage? Is it that simple or is it not?
I mean, do you mean on like a year-to-year basis?
Yeah, you know, if you have you hire an employee and it costs you so much in salary, but along with that comes the benefits and the retirement and the, you know, the Social Security, FICA, all of that. And I don't know if there's a percent in it on top of that, I guess is what I'm asking for, if there is.
I mean, you know, we could certainly look at it.
But that's not a number you normally.
Family.
Right.
Yeah, it varies, okay.
Yeah, it varies because you know how we had a decrease in the health insurance cost this year? That was as simple as, you know, somebody, they had, you know, they were on their spouse's plan or
Insurance
they were on
plan.
their family's plan and they chose not to take the town's health insurance. So, yeah, it really varies depending on what people, and you know, there's some people who they didn't sign up for retirement benefits or, you know, other types of.
I think it depends too on what are they getting paid as a wage, because insurance is pretty much a constant for everybody.
Right.
So somebody who's got
Lower
a lower
paid
wage,
as
it's
opposed
going
to-
to,
yeah.
you know, be a bigger percentage. Somebody who might be a department head, it might be a lesser percentage.
Right.
So is that really it for everything? Really?
That's it,
Okay.
unless anybody has any
But,
questions.
yeah, about the only comment I have in the list here is the election of budget chair and vice chair, and I think we've typically done that at the end of the last meeting. So I might just shift that over to our last meeting as something that we take care of at that time, which is what we did last year. And does anybody remember who vice chair was?
Kathy?
Didn't we do election for that?
Kathy?
Kathy Young, right? That was what I remembered too, actually.
It works sometimes.
Good memory, kid. Anybody have any questions, follow-up comments? Yes, Mark?
Basically, you're saying is, at the end of our sessions, we will elect next year's chair, and you were elected as chair at the end of last year's
Correct,
meetings.
correct.
Okay.
Yep. I mean, you can always have an uprising and, you know, it's a majority rule, very democratic here, so that's,
Basically means that you've been through it for a full year at least, and you supposedly know what you're doing at this point in time.
well, I was chair last year, and I'm chair again this year, but that's probably an anomaly. Most of the time, people tend to be chair in their third year and out, but I was in an earlier 3-year session and served as chair the last part of that one, so.
It's quite the power struggle.
Yeah, yeah. Not being quick enough to the door, I think, is, yeah, Robin.
I have a question. Where is the school in their budget process?
That's a really good question. I usually don't get their assessment until beginning of March, and they don't even send the final assessment through. It's kind of just an estimate of what it might be looking at. I think I came out a week earlier than we did last year, so I think that's why I haven't heard anything from them yet.
Don't they have community input meetings it's like March 15th or March 27th or something? They do. Yeah. It would be good probably for us to stay on top of what the opportunities are for input, and because they do a similar process like we do, where they ask for.
Several years ago, there was somebody on this budget committee who was also on their budget
And
committee.
John?
That was, so that was nice to hear what was going on.
That'd be helpful.
Yeah.
Yes.
And our physical year is matched with the school year and all of our contracts with our unions and stuff. It's
Yes.
all on the same physical year.
Well, I mean, our fiscal year begins July 1, correct? Runs to June 30, which is also our town tax year. I mean, it's the same thing. Your policeman union is up this year, but it's a 3-year cycle typically, or?
Yes, yep.
But I don't know I don't know in the school teacher unions what their contracts are, if they're 3 or they could be varying lengths. So I don't know that those things match up exactly, but the cycle of when the year begins for the budget, I think, is the same. All right, well, thank you all. We will see you next week here at 6:30. Any of the others, your names are in your book here, you know. Tell them to come on down.